What if the most powerful military on Earth is not facing a battlefield? It cannot destroy, but a battlefield it cannot completely control. What if the real weapon moving through the darkness is not a missile, not a fighter jet, and not a bomb? What if the most dangerous weapon in this conflict is uncertainty itself? Because somewhere between the mountains of Iran, the airfields of the Middle East, and the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz, something changed. The explosions were not new. The aircraft were not new. The missile launches were not new. For 7 consecutive nights, the world watched a familiar pattern unfold. American aircraft entered contested airspace. Iranian military infrastructure was struck. Air defenses were challenged. Missile facilities were targeted. The message appeared simple: reduce Iran's ability to threaten American forces and global shipping. But then came the 8th night, and the battlefield revealed a different story. Not through a new weapon, not through a new target, through 2 words: swiftly punish. 2 words buried inside an official military statement. 2 words that changed the meaning of the entire campaign. Because there is a difference between destroying capability and imposing consequences. And that difference is where this war becomes far more complicated than a simple exchange of missiles. The question is no longer only, can the United States strike Iran? The answer to that has been demonstrated. The deeper question is, can military power force an opponent to change its behavior? And that question leads directly to the true hero of this story: the Strait of Hormuz, a geographic feature that appears almost ordinary on a world map. But beneath the surface, it is one of the most strategically important locations on Earth. Look at it from space, a thin passage of blue water connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. But inside that narrow corridor flows something much larger: energy trade, global economic stability. Every ship passing through carries more than cargo. It carries the assumption that the global system will continue operating. And that assumption is exactly what makes the Strait so powerful. Because modern warfare is not only about destroying objects, it is about attacking confidence. A missile strike can destroy a radar installation. But the fear that another missile might appear tomorrow can affect markets, governments, and military planning around the world. The battlefield begins long before the first explosion. It begins inside decision rooms, inside command centers, inside the calculations of people asking one question: what happens if we are wrong? But here is the contradiction. The same geography that gives Iran leverage also creates a vulnerability. Because controlling a choke point requires more than threatening it. It requires maintaining the ability to influence events after the threat is made. And that is where the conflict becomes a battle between 2 completely different military philosophies. One side built around precision, technology, and overwhelming information. The other built around pressure, uncertainty, and the ability to survive under attack. The United States does not approach the region as a single weapon system. It approaches it as a network: aircraft, satellite, electronic warfare, intelligence platforms, long-range strike systems. Naval forces, every element exists to solve one problem. How do you maintain control in an environment where the enemy is trying to make control impossible? Iran's strategy developed around a different question: how do you challenge a stronger opponent without fighting the same war? For decades, Iranian military planners understood a basic reality. In a direct conventional conflict, they would face a much larger and more technologically advanced opponent. So instead of trying to match American power weapon for weapon, they searched for places where American strength created dependence: shipping routes, regional alliances, energy markets, political pressure, the invisible connections holding the system together. That is the foundation of asymmetric warfare. The weaker side does not need to become stronger everywhere. It only needs to find the few places where pressure creates disproportionate effects. And the Strait of Hormuz is one of those places. But the part most people miss is that the strait itself is not the weapon. The uncertainty around the strait is, a tanker captain does not need to see a missile launch to feel pressure. An insurance company does not need a ship to sink before changing its calculations. A government does not need energy supplies to stop before preparing for the possibility alone creates strategic effects. And that is why this conflict is not simply about missiles hitting targets. It is about controlling perception. Because in modern warfare, perception can become a military asset. A radar system creates awareness. An aircraft creates destruction, but uncertainty creates hesitation. And hesitation changes decisions. The lesson here is that military power is no longer measured only by what a country can destroy. It is measured by what it can prevent, what it can deter, what behavior it can influence before a weapon is ever launched. That is why the eighth night mattered. The strikes themselves, but the meaning behind them was larger. The United States was no longer communicating only. We are reducing your ability to attack. The message became, certain actions will produce a different level of response. And that shift matters because deterrence depends on credibility. An enemy must believe that certain decisions will create consequences. Otherwise, every warning becomes only a statement. The Jordan attack exposed that calculation. For weeks, Iranian forces had launched missile and drone attacks against American positions and regional partners. Many attacks were intercepted. Defense systems performed their missions, but saturation warfare follows a different mathematical reality. A defense system can defeat individual threats, but when multiple weapons arrive from different directions at the same time, the defender faces a different challenge. The problem is no longer whether the system works. The problem is whether the system can handle every possible decision the attacker creates. A radar operator watching multiple tracks does not see a simple problem. They see seconds, one mistake, one gap, one successful missile, and the entire strategic message changes. That is what happened in Jordan. 2 American service members were killed. The first American deaths in this conflict since its opening days, and that changed the political and military calculation, because casualties transform conflicts. Before casualties, leaders debate objectives. After casualties, leaders debate credibility. The question becomes, if an attack produces no significant change, what message does that send? And if the response becomes too large, where does escalation end? This is the impossible balance every military leader faces. Respond strongly enough to restore, but not so strongly that the conflict expands beyond control. That tension defines the modern battlefield, because the enemy is not only the opponent, the enemy is uncertainty. And every action creates another question. Iran expected American casualties to create political pressure. Historically, that calculation has sometimes influenced American military decisions. But this time, the response revealed something different. The attack did not slow the campaign. It changed its character. The target list expanded, the language changed. The strategic message became sharper. The conflict moved from capability reduction toward accountability. And that is where the world saw the first glimpse of the hidden war beneath the visible one. Because the aircraft flying over Iran were not simply destroying targets. They were sending signals to commanders, signals to allies, signals to markets, signals to every actor watching the conflict. The battlefield had become a conversation, and every strike was a sentence. But the biggest question remained unanswered. Was this really a war about missiles, aircraft, and bases? Or was something deeper happening? Because the weapons on the battlefield were only the visible layer. The real struggle was happening somewhere else. Inside information networks, inside economic systems, inside political calculations, inside the minds of decision makers trying to predict the next move. Everyone was watching the explosions, but they were missing the battlefield underneath, and that battlefield was about to become the most important one of all. The eighth night changed the story, but not because of the number of targets destroyed, not because of the aircraft launched, not because of the missiles that crossed hundreds of miles before reaching their objectives. The deeper change happened somewhere inside the calculations of every commander watching the map, because the battlefield had revealed something larger. The war was never only about striking Iran. It was about controlling uncertainty. And at the center of that uncertainty sits one geographic feature that has shaped military strategy for decades: the Strait of Hormuz. A narrow waterway, a few dozen miles wide at its narrowest points, a passage that appears almost insignificant on a globe. But on an economic map, it becomes something else entirely. A pressure point, a place where military power, energy markets, and global politics collide. On a satellite image, the strait looks blue water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Tankers moving slowly through one of the busiest energy corridors on Earth. But the simplicity is deceptive, because the real battle is not fought only over the ships moving through the water. It is fought over whether those ships believe they can move safely at all. And that distinction changes everything. A missile does not need to sink a tanker to create strategic damage. It only needs to make companies question whether sending that tanker through the water is worth the risk. The weapon is not always the explosion. Sometimes the weapon is uncertainty. And this is the battlefield that Iran has spent decades preparing, because Iran understands something that larger conventional militaries often struggle with. You do not always need to defeat an opponent's entire military. Sometimes you only need to create enough pressure that the opponent begins changing its own behavior. That is the hidden logic behind asymmetric warfare. A smaller power does not compete symmetrically. It searches for the vulnerabilities created by dependence. And the Strait of Hormuz represents one of the world's greatest strategic dependencies. Every day, energy flows through this narrow corridor: oil, natural gas, global economic stability. Thousands of companies, millions of consumers. Okay, to a waterway where a single crisis can send signals across the entire planet. But here's the problem. The same geography that gives Iran leverage also creates its greatest strategic vulnerability, because a choke point is powerful only when you can influence it. It becomes dangerous when the world begins adapting around it. And that is where modern warfare becomes much more complicated. Everyone sees the missiles. Everyone sees the aircraft. Everyone sees the explosions. But the real competition is over adaptation. Who changes faster? Who learns faster? Who can force the other side to react? The United States has built an entire military architecture around this question. Not just aircraft, not just ships. AI systems, satellites watching movement, electronic warfare aircraft controlling information, intelligence networks identifying threats before they become attacks, long-range bombers creating distance between American forces and enemy defenses. The lesson here is simple. Modern military power is no longer defined only by what can be destroyed. It is defined by what can still function when the enemy is trying to create confusion. Because the battlefield has moved, it is no longer just land. It is the electromagnetic spectrum, the information network, the supply chain, the political environment, the psychological calculation inside enemy command rooms. AA radar operator staring at a screen. A tanker captain deciding whether to enter a dangerous waterway. An energy trader watching prices rise. A military commander deciding whether escalation creates advantage or disaster. All of them are connected. The battlefield has expanded without becoming visible. And that creates the central contradiction of modern warfare. The most powerful military systems in the world can destroy targets with extraordinary precision. But destroying targets is not the same as controlling outcomes. That is the problem every major military faces. How do you win against an opponent who does not need to win conventionally? How do you defeat a strategy designed around uncertainty? The Strait of Hormuz reveals that question perfectly, because Iran does not need to permanently close the waterway to create pressure. It only needs to convince the world that closure is possible. That possibility alone changes calculations. Insurance companies reconsider risk. Shipping companies adjust routes. Governments discuss emergency energy plans. Markets react before any final decision is made. The invisible battlefield appears before the physical battlefield. And that is the transformation most people miss. Everyone thinks this conflict is about missiles, aircraft, and naval power. But the real battle is about decision making under pressure. The side that controls the decisions may control the conflict. This changes everything because military operations are no longer judged only by the damage they inflict. They are judged by the behavior they create. A strike that destroys a radar site may matter, but a strike that forces an opponent to change its strategy matters more. A defensive system that intercepts missiles matters, but a system that convinces an enemy that an attack will fail may matter even more. Deterrence is not measured only by what happens. Sometimes it is measured by what never happens. And that brings the conflict to its most important question. What is Iran actually trying to achieve? Because the answer is not simply survival. It is influence for decades. Iran has developed a strategy based on extending its reach beyond its borders. Partner forces, missile networks, naval capabilities, regional pressure points. The goal is not necessarily to defeat stronger opponents directly. The goal is to make every opponent's decision more complicated, to create multiple problems at the same time, to turn military superiority into a political challenge. But the same strategy carries a risk, because every pressure point creates a possible escalation point. Every proxy creates a possible loss of control. Every missile launch creates a calculation about response. And once casualties occur, the strategic equation changes. Because leaders are no longer only calculating military advantage. They are calculating credibility, reputation, domestic pressure, international reaction. This is why the word punish matters beyond language. It represents a shift from managing capability to shaping behavior. The message is no longer only, we can destroy your systems. The message becomes, we can change the cost of your decisions. And that is the heart of strategic competition, not destruction calculation. The bigger picture is that future conflicts may not be decided by the country with the largest arsenal. They may be decided by the country that best integrates technology, intelligence, economics, and psychology into one coherent strategy. The Strait of Hormuz represents that future, a place where a missile threat becomes an economic threat, where a military decision becomes a political decision, where a few miles of water can influence decisions thousands of miles away. Because modern warfare is no longer simply about controlling territory. It is about controlling choices. And that may be the most important lesson from this conflict. The question is no longer who has the strongest weapons. The real question is, who can create the most powerful system of pressure, protection, and adaptation before uncertainty becomes defeat? Because the next generation of wars may not be won by the force that destroys the most. They may be won by the force that understands the battlefield nobody else can see. So the question for the future is this: will the next great conflicts be decided by superior firepower, or by whoever can control the invisible battlefield of information, economics, and human decision-making?